So I was supposed to be with Alex, so I'll give them some credit. We've done this whole thing together, but I will present because they couldn't come today. But I'm here to speak about the tyranny of metrics. So it's a very fancy and maybe seems a bit threatening title, and I cannot say that I came up with it because it comes from this book by Jerry Muller, who is a history researcher. And I really love this book and I really recommend it to people, and I thought that most of the book doesn't speak of, actually none of the book speaks about game development or video games. It's mostly about society and how metric influence our choices in hospital, in education, and all of that. But I thought it would be a very interesting topic to bring in the video game industry. So just to start, what are metric? So when we speak about metric, at least in the video game development industry, we have kind of three different types of metric. So the user metric, the process metric, and the performance. So user metric is everything that is related to your user. So how many kills, how many time is he spending on something, how many money is he spending on your game. The performance metric is more about the performance of your technical system. So the frame per second and all of that. And then the process metric is all about more of how your developers are doing, how much have they worked on, and all of that. So the one I'm interested in, and because I only have 15 minutes, I will speak about the user metric. And to start this thing, I wanted to start with a quote from Watchdog, which is, "You are no longer an individual, you are a data cluster bound to a vast global network." Because it was a pretty good quote to start with. And it is what happens when you do use metric. It's a beautiful thing because it enables us to have access to so much knowledge and to be able to see the behavior of so many people at the same time. But also it becomes this big data cluster, and that can have downside. So just to a bit introduce a little bit the thing, why are metric so important nowadays, and why are they so important in the video game industry and video game development? So you have some quotes which kind of show the way we see them now, which is if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it, or what gets measured gets done. And I think that's kind of the mindset that we have with metric. We see them as a replacement of judgment. So mostly because now in our societies, or at least in some firms, we tend to take managers outside of the people we have working for us and the employees. So those people, they're coming and they have to do a quick appraisal. They have to understand what happens, what works, what doesn't. They have to make decisions and they have a lot of pressure. So obviously, metrics seem amazing. I can tell you, 40% of this work, or we've had an improvement of 5%, so we have to keep doing this. And it also fears, and like they said, that we can measure everything. So nothing is going to get by us. We're going to understand everything that's happening. And it's transparent. So it feels good, and we want to believe that we need them. And it's also a very good way to motivate. I'm using metric in my life all the time, and as I said before, I'm doing gamification on scores, so I'm not one to be against metric. But I just wanted to introduce a bit. And another thing that they are is that they feel objective. So that, I think, is one of the reasons we love them so much, because compared to just an opinion of someone saying, I think this team is doing better, or I think this one is not working, then how do you actually debate that? But if you can say, we have a 5% increase, or we have a 10% decrease. And they're so very easy to communicate to everyone. You can do beautiful graph, you can show to everyone what you've done, and it looks really great on paper. But are they really always that trustworthy, or do they seem like that? So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was how in some of the game development processes, they can lead us to have false goals. So you have this quote from Sid Meier, and it says, "The real challenge and the real opportunity is keeping our focus on gameplay. When we forget that and decide it's monetization or other things that are not gameplay focused, then we stray a little bit further from the path." So an example of that, and I don't know if any of you have played this game, it's a smartphone game called Harry Potter Hogwarts Mystery, and the developers kind of wanted to put a bit of a push on monetization, and so you have energy points and then you have to wait a bit if you want to continue and do another action. So it happens that you can be in this position where you can either spend money and save this poor kid from getting strangled, or you can wait for hours and wait for the kid to, maybe survive it. But you just know in your pocket that you have this kid dying and out of breath. So it's maybe it wasn't the goal of the game, which is supposed to be a bit geared towards fans and maybe, of course, a bit of action. But the monetization part and all of those metrics of we have to make people spend more time. And so, of course, if we make them come back every 4 hours, because now they have more energy to save the kid, it's going to look like they came back, and it's going to look like they're very engaged. But is the metric really trustworthy, or is it lying to you? The second thing that I think that metrics are not always the best for in the video game industry is that they can discourage a bit of creativity. Because when you are in the game development process and your CEO or your production officer is asking you, how can you prove that this is going to work? And you're trying to create Portal, a game that just works on weird physics, or Journey, something that has never really been done before. How do you prove that? And it's what Emily Greer said in a GDC talk. You can make a better version of something that was already a success, and that's amazing, and we need to keep using them for that. But how do you actually use metric to be creative? One of the examples is from Dead Space. So the third installment of Dead Space was supposed to kind of go on the same vibe of the two others, which is kind of an atmospheric survival game. But the producers said, oh, actually, action games, they work better. We've seen the metric. More people like them. We should go more in that. And it just didn't work because it wasn't really what was the vibe of Dead Space. And in that sense, the metric kind of lied to them. They told them that it was going to be better if they do it like that, but they blindly followed them, and it didn't work for them. So are metric really objective? Well, you also have to ask yourself, who is deciding which metric are we making? Because in the video game industry, you have so many people. You have the level designer, you have the UX, you have the marketing, and they all have kind of a bias, a point of view that they're going to bring, and they're going to be the one deciding which is the metric you have to use. So some people are going to tell you, we want our people to spend 5 hours on this, or we want our people to say that they're really happy, or we want this and that, and who is right, and who is less biased, and who is more biased. And how do you make a metric for something that is a mix of science and art? Because as we say, art is never finished, it's only abandoned. So which metric is going to tell you that your game is finished, and how do you decide which one is the right one for that one? Also, we use so many proxies to measure something, but how do we know that the proxy we're using is the right one? So some of the ones you may be familiar with are the monthly active user, the average revenue per user, but what we're always trying to measure with this, and rightly so, is our game going to be successful? Because it's a really hard industry to arrive on and to make some space for yourself. And you have to base yourself on something, but how do you know which one is the right metric for your game? Another thing that is quite interesting with metric and with statistics in general is that they can always lie a little bit to you, because you're seeing them. You chose the right one. Everyone on the team agrees with it. You're gonna try to quantify it. You're gonna try to get the statistic, and then it's looking great. It's going up, and you're stopping it, and it's great. And then it goes down. But you didn't think to look at it for 2 months. You looked for a month, and it was great. So when do you stop? How do you know exactly which parameters to choose for your metric? And can you always see the big picture with it? It's also because, as humans, we are hardwired to see patterns and to see links with things. Like, for example, you probably see a square. Oh, well, you're not. Yeah, you do. Sorry, it didn't look like this for me. But I don't see a square. You see a square. But the square is not there. It's just random little icons that I've put together. But we want to see a pattern. And it's the same thing when we see graphs or when we see numbers. Sometimes they lie to us, and we don't really realize it. For example, you have this game, Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. And so the development team, they were looking at people playing it, and they realized that chapter after chapter, less people were playing it. And they told themselves, well, it has to be because it's too hard. It has to be because people are getting frustrated and they just give up on the game. But then, actually, people didn't when they look at another metric. That is the loading page. So every time somebody is loading the game again, it means that they failed or that they're restarting the game. So if it was actually the hard, then you would see that they have to try and try again, and the loading game should be going up, but it doesn't. So sometimes it's really hard to understand the metric by itself. But I still wanted to say that I do believe that metrics are good, and I myself use them quite a lot. And I'm just trying to bring some sort of perspective and to try to see in which case they're good and which case they don't, but also just understand where they're coming from and the bias that come with them and why we're using them. And I think they're very valuable. So at every stage of the development, they enable a rapid iterative testing, which is amazing. And for example, in the A/B testing, when you're comparing, so for some people who don't know, you're going to compare two versions of something, and you're going to modify something. So in one, your player is going to be with a sword, and another one is going to be with an arrow, and you're comparing to see which one has the effect you're looking for. They can be very useful, or for personalizing the player experience. They're very useful, and my talk is not at all about saying that we should not use metric. I was just trying to bring a little bit of perspective on it. So if you have any takeaway that you take from my talk, it would be that you should be really careful with the metric you're trying to use, because they're going to have some bias that you don't realize. And they're sometimes coming from you, from other people, from the game, but they're not always the right one. Also, be careful with the way you interpret numbers, because they can always seem like something, and then you see it from another point of view. You measure it 2 weeks after, you measure it with a different set of people, and it's never that as objective as it seems. And a third one, it's the reason why we try to usually do qualitative testing as much as quantitative, is that they might tell you what your players are doing, and they're great to tell you what most of your players are doing, but it will be always really tricky to understand why they did it like that. So to finish, I wanted to show this quote, which says, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." The cash box.
Now we have time for questions, so if anybody has any questions, I will be throwing this at you. Yeah?
I can catch things, don't worry.
Just talk us down here.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, lovely talk, provoking, interesting. I love data and I love numbers because they're, as you say, they're objective. And you have drawn attention to the subjectivity of interpretation that seems to be problematic, endemic with the use of metrics. Do you think there is any way of identifying any kind of objective interpretation in general, or being able to spot when an interpretation is objective or subjective or informing other agendas or things like that?
I think it's always very tricky, and the most important thing is to triangulate and to have as many measures as you can to see if it's still the same case, or to do it. It really depends, because it could be that on this week it's working and the next week it's not, so maybe just don't test on one specific time or just one specific set of players. It's more about getting as much data from different points of view than just knowing, oh, this one I can trust it blindly and it's always going to be right because I've done everything right. Because you cannot always control everything, and there's always going to be a bit of noise or just random luck.
Any other questions?
That was a really thought-provoking talk. Thank you, I enjoyed it. You did suggest that commercial success doesn't necessarily equate to critical success or, a well-received product. I just wondered if there is a realm for that kind of collective, subjective celebration of a critically successful game, whether that can be a metric or does that need to stay in the qualitative realm? I just wondered what you thought.
I'm not sure I understood your question.
So, can we, I'll try and put it more plainly, can we conceive of a metric for critical success across the collective audience? I don't know.
So, your question is, if people like a game, does that count as a metric?
Yeah, and if you were to try and quantify that or come up with a metric for that, is there
I
a
mean,
way to do that?
The whole point of metric is that you have to ask your question, why am I measuring it? What is the goal of measuring it? So if your goal is to know if people like it and you're not worried about knowing if they will buy it or how much time they're going to spend on it, then yes, of course. But then in the game industry, the whole thing is that we want to buy them and we want people to like them. So it's a bit more complex than that. But every metric is worthwhile. It just depends what your team is looking for.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Yep.
Great talk. So I think there's obviously you presented so much to unpack of like why metrics are misleading or whatever, and you also quite readily say they're like very valuable and you'll never be in a business meeting that's making a decision without a bunch of metrics that people believe in. Did you come across like the suggestions of like what are the best ways to like break out of this like thing? Like I've been in meetings where there's been a bunch of metrics that people are discussing, and everyone in the room has a different definition of how that metric came up. Like, what do we do about that? Like, what can we? Like, is there teachings that we can go read or?
Well, I don't have a book to recommend. Or just maybe. But it is very interesting what you're saying, and I think one of the big problem we have with metric is that people maybe don't understand how they came about. So I think it's very important when we use a metric that everyone who is discussing that metric understands how we got it, what it represents, and what it doesn't represent. Because people tend to just blindly follow a definition that they don't all agree with. But I don't really have a book to recommend. Sorry.
Any other questions? No. Yep.
Thanks. I just wondered if you had any advice from experience working with people who don't believe in metrics. Specifically, I'm thinking our brand team who run market research, and when they get the wrong results, they do it again with a different company.
I don't know if you could do anything about that, because I think they're going with bad faith, and I don't. I think it's.
My corner, unfortunately, but
I really wouldn't know. But I mean, it's all about just working together and trying to not be like, oh, my metric is good and yours is wrong, or I have to do always qualitative testing and I'm against quantitative. And if you're going with a team that is not ready to have that conversation, I think you cannot change their mind.
that's okay.